All stories over the next 1 hour have been covered individually on this channel before, but in this video I've combined them into one big compilation. That way you can watch them all in one go. From strange runway encounters to unusual emergencies, mysteries and serious crashes. You'll get the full set of aviation stories in one sitting. Let's get right into it. Starting in the early days of fly-by-wire technology, Indian Airline Flight 605's fatal approach into Bangalore in 1990. It's February of 1990 in Mumbai. This Indian Airlines flight has flown in from Goa the previous night. It will now fly as IC605 to Bangalore. The pilot in command is Captain Satish, fairly experienced with more than 10,000 hours of flying. Alongside him is the second operating pilot, Captain Cyril. Captain Cyril will be the pilot flying today, as he is undertaking a route check supervision under Captain Satish. This route check is being used to assess Captain Cyril's ability to act as the captain on the A320. The flight is set to depart at 11 AM on that day. However, there has been a delay and the aircraft departs just 2 minutes before noon. The entire sequence of the flight, from the pushback, starting of the engines, taxiing to the runway, and then taking off, all the way to cruise, has been uneventful. After taking off from Mumbai, IC605 flies at 33,000 feet and has no reported issues during the cruise so far. Around 30 minutes after departure, at 12:25, IC605 contacts Bangalore's ATC and gets confirmation that the weather at Bangalore is good and overall conditions are clear. The ATC then assigns them runway 09 for landing. 20 minutes later, IC605 is authorized by the ATC to descend down to 11,000 feet. During this descent, the aircraft is slightly higher than usual, and to allow for a faster descent, the speed brakes are also used. At 12:58, the captain then conducts an approach checklist to ensure that the aircraft is ready for approach into Bangalore. They have descended down to 8,500 feet and are about 5 to 10 minutes away from landing. At this point, the pilots cross-check their approach speed of 132 knots. This is the minimum speed that the pilots will target to maintain when landing. With the aircraft now ready for its final approach, and just a few minutes away from landing, the flaps are extended and the landing gear is also deployed. At 1 PM, IC605 is just 7 miles from runway 09, and the pilots have visual sighting. Hence, they disconnect the autopilot. All this while, the aircraft has been descending using a mode on the Airbus A320 called the vertical speed mode. In this vertical speed mode, the pilots select a target altitude and a target rate of climb or descent, which the airplane then maintains. An easy way to remember this is that in vertical speed mode, the aircraft maintains a constant speed, and in open mode, the aircraft maintains a constant engine thrust. A short while later, whilst being only a couple of minutes away from landing, there seems to have been an action that resulted in the vertical speed mode changing to the idle open descent mode. It is also crucial to note that this change is only possible if a lower altitude is selected. There are 3 theories that have been put forward as to why this change could have happened. The first one is the wrong button theory. In this, it's assumed that the pilots made a mistake when they were changing the descent rate from 1,000 feet per minute to 700 feet per minute. They mistook the altitude knob, which sits very close to the vertical speed selection knob, and selected 700 feet of altitude and not the 700 feet per minute of descent rate. As this would have been a lower altitude than what they were flying at, the aircraft switched into idle open mode. However, data that was taken from the flight recorder showed that the engine pressure ratio temporarily increased. The engine power would usually increase if the aircraft was climbing and not descending had they chosen a lower altitude. Hence, this theory can be ruled out. The second theory states that there was a malfunction of the internal flight computer. This could have happened due to a serious incorrect signal input between the system. The reset of the FCU meant that the altitude would have auto-resetted to 100 feet. This again would mean a lower altitude than the current altitude that they were flying at, and hence the mode would have changed to an open mode. However, Airbus forwarded a reply on the 19th of September 1990 stating the following: There has never been a report of any malfunctions of the FCU altitude resetting. There are 2 FCU channels, and in the case that one fails, the other can take over and function properly. Hence, this theory is very unlikely and can also be ruled out. The most probable theory is the third, an altitude mistake. Most pilots tend to put an altitude setting in the case that they need to go around. Airbus has suggested that the pilot first selected a higher altitude in the case of a missed approach and put in 6,000 feet. He realized that this was not the correct time for such a selection, as changing the altitude would cause the aircraft to change its modes. Immediately, the pilot reversed the altitude knob to a lower altitude through a wrist flick. This would have triggered the mode to change to an open idle descent. To support this theory, Airbus also provided evidence of the slight increase in the engine pressure ratio. This is due to the higher set altitude momentarily of 6,000 feet, as gaining altitude would need more power. Also, flight voice recorders were analyzed and provided evidence that during this time, the pilot was heard saying,
"Missed approach altitude."
This indicates that his intention was to set a higher altitude in the case of a go-around. It appears that after selecting the lower altitude, the pilot did not scan the flight parameters to see the result of his selection. At this point, the speed of the aircraft is slowly starting to drop. The aircraft's nose pitch is also increasing to prevent it from descending too quick. Captain Satish is heard saying, "You're descending in idle open, huh?" Clearly in confusion. As this is going on, the flight directors on the Airbus A320 are also working. A flight director is a guidance aid that is overlaid on the display, and this shows the pilot what pitch and bank angles to maintain. Captain Satish is aware that if the flight directors are switched off, the mode automatically changes back to the vertical speed mode. Knowing this, he asks Captain Cyril to turn the flight directors off. On the Airbus A320, there are 2 flight director switches, one for each pilot. However, it seems that Captain Cyril only switches off his own switch, and the second switch that is in front of Captain Satish never gets switched off. To this, Captain Satish says, "You did not switch off mine." It seems that at this point, there was confusion and the first hint of panic creeping in. There is a possibility that Captain Cyril may have pressed on both the switches to turn off the flight directors, but not sufficient pressure was applied, and hence the second flight director in front of Captain Satish remains switched on. A few seconds later, the speed has now dropped down to 121 knots. As the idle mode is still activated, and nothing has been done to rectify to switch it back to a vertical speed mode. Surprisingly, neither of the pilots call out the speed being too low, and at this stage, there is very less time remaining to save this aircraft. 1 second later, the call out for 200 feet is heard.
200.
Hearing this call out, Captain Satish is in shock that the aircraft has still not changed its mode back to the vertical speed mode. Just after the call out for 200 feet, Captain Cyril realizes that they are about to crash. Captain Satish is pulling back on the side stick to try and raise the nose up aggressively, as he is aware of their proximity to the ground below. This action triggers a safety protection that Airbus has, called Alpha Floor. If the side stick is pulled back more than 14 degrees, the flight computer automatically puts the aircraft's engine in a full power mode. This ideally should help the aircraft get out of dangerously low speed situations. However, the sequence of the pilot pulling back the side stick, the system activating in the FCU, and then the engines fully powering up takes about 8 seconds. And as the engines start to power up, the aircraft is already sinking rapidly and is only at 106 knots of speed, just 110 feet above the approaching golf course that lies ahead of it. Unfortunately, they just do not have the 8 seconds needed to get the engines to full power, and the aircraft has become unrecoverable at this point. Just 2 seconds later, the aircraft contacts the ground in a golf course that lies in the path of the runway. The first impact does not cause any damage as the aircraft bounces on its rear landing gear. The aircraft then rolls for 80 feet on its main wheels, then goes back in the air and then hops for another 230 feet, hitting a few trees in its path. The aircraft then hits the ground again on all of its wheels, this time digging deep into the golf course's grass. The aircraft then collides with an embankment, which forms the boundary of the golf course and the airport. This impact causes the engines to get detached from the wing. The landing gears are also broken as a result. At the time the aircraft has stopped, it's only 150 feet away from the boundary wall of the airport. The wreckage of this aircraft is scattered. Engine 1 and 2, which separated, fall on the road ahead. The landing gear structure has also been destroyed. The wings, though, remain attached to the fuselage. The fuel tanks in the aircraft still hold 3,500 kilograms of fuel. This leaks through the wing, which has ruptured and starts a fire. This fire starts in the forward fuselage and then later spreads towards the rear. It's the rapidly spreading fire that leads to the casualties in this incident. Following this, an investigation is then launched and a court proceeding was conducted. The court's official report contains 600 pages of information, which I've condensed down into this video. Fast forward to Russia. Aeroflot Flight 593's plunge, a stark reminder of the dangers when cockpit protocols are breached in unexpected ways. It's March in 1994 in Moscow. Russia's national airline Aeroflot is scheduled to fly from Moscow to Hong Kong as flight AFL 593. The crew today has 3 pilots instead of the usual 2, due to the long duration of the journey. Pilot in command, Captain Danilov. His backup pilot, Captain Kudrinsky, and co-pilot Piskarev. All 3 pilots are type-rated on the Airbus A310 aircraft, which is in use today, and have had training provided just a few months prior on the Moscow-Hong Kong route. It's also worth noting that neither of the pilots have had any prior safety-related incidents. Also on board the flight are 63 passengers and 9 cabin crew members. Amongst those passengers are Captain Kudrinsky's children, his daughter Yana, and his older son Eldar. There is also another pilot, Maskarev, who is flying as a passenger on this flight. At 4:39 p.m., the aircraft departs Moscow. It has a regular pushback, engine start, then taxis to the runway and takes off. About 12 minutes later, it reaches its initial cruise altitude of 30,000 feet. It stays at that altitude for around half an hour, and once it's a bit lighter after burning some fuel, it climbs further up to 33,000 feet. The aircraft then maintains that altitude for the next 3.5 hours. At this point in the flight, the pilot in command, Captain Danilov, decides to head to the crew rest area for a couple of hours to take some rest. And his backup pilot, Captain Kudrinsky, comes in and takes up the left seat in the cockpit. Co-pilot Piskarev is sat on the right-hand seat as per usual. Then, at 40 minutes past 5 p.m., 3 other people who are flying as passengers enter the cockpit. These are Captain Kudrinsky's 2 children, his 15-year-old son Eldar and 13-year-old daughter Yana, and Maskarev, who is a pilot but flying as a passenger on this flight. The 3 of them are simply stood in the cockpit for the first few minutes, observing the cockpit and likely engaging in conversation with Captain Kudrinsky and co-pilot Piskarev, both of who are sat on their seats. Then, a few minutes later, Captain Kudrinsky invites his daughter to sit in the left seat where he is currently sat at. He leaves his seat without formally transferring the controls of the aircraft to the co-pilot sat next to him. Then, Yana sits down on the left seat and asks for the seat to be raised. And then for the next 4 minutes or so, she sits and calmly observes the cockpit without touching any instruments or controls. After that, Captain Kudrinsky invites her to fly the aircraft a little bit, and he says, "Go ahead and take the controls." Following this exchange, for the next 3 minutes, Captain Kudrinsky shows Yana how the aircraft is flown, and he performs the following maneuver. First, he engages the heading select sub-mode, and then he turns the heading select knob to the left. This makes the aircraft turn towards the left. Then he turns this heading knob back to the right to return back to the planned flight route, and then engages the navigation sub-mode so that the aircraft can return to its initial planned route. Once this is done, Yana gets up and leaves the captain's seat. Captain Kudrinsky has performed this demonstration whilst he was not sat at his seat. This would have also been distracting for the rest of the crew. Overall, Yana was sat occupying the captain's seat for 7.5 minutes. Then, 15 minutes later, co-pilot Piskarev spoke on the radio with the Novosibirsk control tower, and he reported passing overhead and gave them the estimated arrival at the next waypoint. Just around this time, Captain Kudrinski's son Eldar then asks for permission to sit on the captain's seat where his sister Yana had sat earlier. Once Eldar has sat and adjusted himself onto the seat, Captain Kudrinski decides to show him how to fly the aircraft and performs a similar demo as he had done before when he showed Yana. After the demo has been done, Eldar's curiosity takes over and he asks his dad if he can turn the control wheel. And to this request, his father, Captain Kudrinski, agrees and gives him permission. Eldar first applies a force to the control wheel to turn the aircraft to the left. But the autopilot being on and functioning normally resists this interference by deflecting the right aileron to try and bring the aircraft back to the right. Captain Kudrinski then engages the heading select submode on the autopilot and turns the heading select knob to the left by a value more than 15 degrees off the initial heading that they were flying at. The autopilot then takes over, deflects the left ailerons, and turns the aircraft to the left. When the bank angle is around 20 degrees, Captain Kudrinski turns the heading select knob back to the right to return the aircraft to its planned heading. The autopilot once again responds to this by moving the right aileron and inducing a right turn. Then, he engages the navigation submode on the autopilot and expects the aircraft to return to its original planned route. At this time, two other things are happening in the background. Firstly, Yana is speaking to her dad, Captain Kudrinski, and as a result he is distracted and not monitoring his son's actions. Secondly, as the aircraft is turning right using the autopilot, the control wheel is still being held by about 3 degrees to the right by Eldar. And as the autopilot tries to reduce this right turn to level off and come out on the correct heading, the control wheel being held prevents this from happening. And at this stage, the autopilot keeps trying harder each second to stop this right turn. On the Airbus A310, when the autopilot is engaged, the aileron on either side of the aircraft's wing can react to keep the roll rate in control. The control column in the cockpit can also be used even though the autopilot is engaged, and it can also apply a force on the ailerons as well. And when the combined forces on the control wheels exceeds 11 kilograms, it declutches the aileron actuator. This shifts the aircraft's lateral control, which is the turn, from an autopilot mode to a manual mode, whilst keeping the aircraft's longitudinal control, which is its height control, in the autopilot mode. Usually, this disengagement of the autopilot can be felt when the force on the control wheel drops. However, there are no alarms or warning indicators to inform the pilots that this disengagement has happened. As the forces experienced on the control wheel keeps increasing, as Eldar has held the control wheel to the right, the autopilot tries harder to fight this. This causes the force on the control wheel to increase above 11 kilograms. And as shown earlier, this disconnects it from the lateral control system. And the aircraft is now in a manual control mode for the turn. Neither of the pilots are actually trained to understand how this mechanism works and what to do in such a case. Eldar, being just 15 years old and not having any flying experience, would not have been able to determine that the autopilot had disconnected itself from the lateral control mode. Now, despite the autopilot being disengaged, the control wheel is still being held slightly to the right, and this causes the right bank angle of the aircraft to start increasing gradually. However, initially, this goes unnoticed by Captain Kudrinski and his co-pilot Piskarev. And then, a short while later, this bank angle increases to 20 degrees and keeps rolling to the right at about 1 degree per second. Because of the slow increase in this bank angle, it goes unnoticed in the cockpit and the pilots are unaware that the aircraft is in a turn. Captain Kudrinski at this point is thinking that the aircraft is back on its initial heading and flying straight. The control wheel keeps being held by Eldar with increasing force than before, and this is causing the right turn to increase more rapidly. Beyond 20 degrees of bank angle, the rate at which the aircraft keeps turning has risen from 1 degree per second, and shortly, the aircraft's bank angle exceeds 30 degrees. This excessive bank angle is first noticed by Eldar himself, and he draws attention to his father and says, "Why is it turning?" To which Captain Kudrinski replies, asking, "Is it turning by itself?" Makarov, a passenger on this flight who is also in the cockpit and also a commercial pilot, makes an incorrect suggestion that the aircraft has entered a holding pattern. A holding pattern is a set course that the aircraft follows when it's awaiting further clearance to either proceed ahead or land. This misinterpretation of the holding pattern by Makarov is likely due to the aircraft's bank angle, which he misinterprets as the aircraft trying to follow a course. As the bank angle keeps further increasing and reaches 50 degrees, neither of them react to this extreme bank angle. Due to the sharp turn, the aircraft can no longer maintain its altitude, and as a result, the aircraft now begins to descend. As the speed of the aircraft begins to increase in a descent, the aircraft begins to undergo buffeting, essentially a form of vibration and oscillation that can happen when the airflow over the wing keeps detaching. This causes the nose of the aircraft to pitch up sharply from 5 degrees to 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. Captain Kudrinsky is heard shouting to Eldar, telling him to hold the control column tight. As the pilots were busy in conversing, they had all lost situational awareness before this moment. Then, only a few seconds later, the bank angle is now at 63 degrees. At this point, co-pilot Piskarev turns the wheel sharply to the left to counter this right turn. However, Eldar, who is still sat in the left side seat, has held the control wheel to the right as before. Note that at this stage, due to the rapid rate at which the aircraft is turning and the forces experienced inside, it is not easy anymore for Eldar to get out and hand over the controls to his father. Within seconds, they have reached a bank angle of 90 degrees, and it's become almost impossible to recover from this situation. The action to counteract the right turn by the co-pilot was taken too late, as had he done this when the aircraft's bank angle was below 40 degrees, there would have been enough time and aileron effectiveness to get the aircraft leveled out. During this time, both the captain and co-pilot can be heard saying, "The other way, turn left, left," implying to Eldar to turn the control wheel to the left and not to the right as he's doing so. Then, the warning alarms in the cockpit all start to go off. Altitude discrepancies, stall, and the autopilot off. The nose of the aircraft begins to drop sharply, and within 10 seconds, the nose has pitched down to almost 50 degrees. The speed is also rapidly increasing as the aircraft falls towards the ground. Then, the speed exceeds the maximum allowable limits. In response to this overspeed, co-pilot Piskarev shouts, "Throttle to idle," and then puts the engine thrust to idle and proceeds to pull the control column all the way to the back. This puts the nose up sharply. By pitching the nose up and reducing the engine power at once, there is a rapid drop in the airspeed, and this time, the airspeed drops below the critical level. This leads to another problem. Due to the very low airspeed, the aircraft enters into a spin whilst falling towards the ground. This is almost uncontrollable, as there is not enough airspeed to use the ailerons to stop the spin. Also, as the aircraft is now vertically dropping towards the ground, this induces a sense of weightlessness. Seeing the airspeed being so low, the co-pilot then shouts, "Full power," and then puts the throttles ahead to try and get the airspeed to increase. At the same time, Captain Kudrinsky also manages to regain his seat, finally. This time though, there is only a couple thousand feet of altitude remaining. Not much can be done to recover this aircraft. A few seconds later, with all attempts having failed, Flight 593 crashes into the ground near the area of a town known as Mesas. The air traffic control calls the aircraft repeatedly, but as expected, receives no response back. About an hour and a half later, the air traffic control is informed that an aircraft has crashed and flames that can be seen coming from the crash site. A rescue operation is launched using a search helicopter, but it's impossible to land at this crash site as it's night and the area is wooded and mountainous. On the 22nd of March, the next day, a team of 238 people is formed to conduct a search and rescue operation. Unfortunately, this soon turns into a recovery operation as there are no survivors to this crash due to the high-speed impact. Next, a Boeing 727 vanishing from Angola in 2003, with theories from theft to foul play. Still a mystery after 2 decades. Luanda's airport has both international and domestic terminal buildings, allowing key routes and destinations to be flown to. However, on the complete end of the airport is an isolated area where this Boeing 727 has been sat for the last 14 months. Before this aircraft got here, we need to revisit its 28-year-long history. The aircraft was manufactured in 1975 by Boeing. It was sold to American Airlines during its expansion years to meet the growing demand for air travel in the 1970s. American Airlines extensively utilized this aircraft on domestic routes for 25 years, until the year 2000, by which it had racked up 68,500 hours on its airframe. In 2002, the aircraft was in process of being sold to an Angolan-based company that wanted to use it to transport fuel to diamond mines. It was in the process of having its seats removed and replaced with 10 500-liter tanks. This would allow for the fuel required to operate the machinery in the diamond mines to be delivered directly. This was critical due to the ongoing civil war in Angola, which would result in roads being blocked by rebels for several months. For this, the aircraft was flown to Luanda and parked at the airport in a separate stand. During this time, the business deal for transporting fuel fell through, and unfortunately the aircraft remained parked for another 14 months, all the way till May of 2003. During this 14-month period, it racked up airport parking fees of $4 million. The aircraft was then sold to a South African buyer and was to fly out to its new owner, Air Gemini, soon. To handle this entire operation, Ben Padilla was hired by the aerospace sales and leasing company to oversee the aircraft operations. Ben was a certified flight mechanic and also had a private pilot license. He had hired John Mutantu to assist him in getting the aircraft ready for its move to the South African owner. On the 25th of May 2003, both Ben and John were intending to get the aircraft systems tested and had also planned to conduct engine run tests. This would get the aircraft ready to fly out a couple of days later. At around 5:30 on that evening, they were both seen walking to the parked aircraft. They then got onto the aircraft through the rear staircase. This is when things began to get a bit suspicious. The aircraft's engines turned on. However, the internal radio and transponder, which is used for communicating with the air traffic controller, was never switched on. This meant that the air traffic control could neither communicate nor locate the aircraft on their radar. Shortly after, at 45 minutes past the hour, the aircraft started to move. The air traffic controllers were confused, as neither of them had given permission to this aircraft to taxi. They described the movement of this aircraft as being erratic. This indicated that whoever was behind the controls did not have the experience required to operate this aircraft. Within a few seconds, the aircraft had taxied towards the runway. It then took a right turn, throttled up, and then hurtled down the runway and took off. The air traffic controllers watched this in utter confusion. The aircraft then gained height and flew away. This would have likely been the last view that the air traffic controllers would have of this aircraft, as after this, it would never be found again. The FBI also put out a notice requesting any help in locating the two men. A picture of Ben Padilla was available. However, there seems to be no picture of John Mutantu. The disappearance of this aircraft is bizarre. The US government, FBI, and the CIA have spent several years and resources in locating this aircraft. However, they have been unsuccessful. Some believe that the most credible theory is that the plane was flown out of the Angolan airspace as part of an insurance fraud. This would then help to avoid paying the $4 million in fees. Others say that Ben was possibly coerced into flying the plane by his helper John. They suggest that John was trying to transport illegal firearms and possibly drugs into another country. However, all of this is only speculation. The most likely theory is the simplest. The unqualified pilots crashed it, and the aircraft was lost to the Atlantic Ocean. Next up, a midnight takeoff in stormy Cameroon. Kenya Airways Flight 507's rapid descent into disaster in 2007, revealing several lessons in pilot decision-making. It's 10 p.m. at Douala's International Airport in Cameroon. This Kenya Airways Boeing 737 is carrying out a multi-leg journey and has flown in from the Ivory Coast earlier in the evening. It will now fly as KQ507 on its final leg from Cameroon to Kenya. What makes this flight slightly unusual today is that there are thunderstorms in this region and the visibility is poor. This makes the conditions riskier than usual and severely unfavorable for flying. On board the flight are 108 passengers and 8 crew members. The aircraft's pilot crew today is a mix, with the captain having significant experience. Captain Francis has over 8,000 hours of flying and is 52 years of age. Captain Francis is also flying with his co-pilot, First Officer Andrew. The flight is scheduled to depart at 11 p.m. However, the increasing rainfall and reduced visibility has led to Captain Francis cancelling the departure. Around 54 minutes later, he requests the air traffic control for a delayed departure. He is granted the permission and KQ507 is ready to go. 4 minutes later, the aircraft's engines are switched on, flaps are set to 5 degrees, flight controls are checked, and the weather radar is also switched on. Shortly past midnight, KQ507 gets cleared to taxi to runway 12. The air traffic controller requests the pilots to call back when they are lined up and ready to take off. Whilst taxiing to the runway, the captain has noticed on his weather radar that the weather ahead, right after takeoff, is deteriorating due to increasing rainfall and further reduced visibility. He requests the air traffic controller for clearance in modifying his route shortly after takeoff. The weather radar on the Boeing 737 shows the weather pattern ahead through a color map. For instance, in this image, the green displays no or light rain, yellow shows moderate, red indicates heavy rainfall, and magenta shows thunderstorms. The air traffic controller gets back, confirming that KQ507 is clear to maintain a heading slightly right to the runway after takeoff. At around the same time, another aircraft, which is flying back to Morocco, decides to cancel its departure due to worries of poor weather. Kenya Airways, however, has decided to continue. 5 minutes past midnight, KQ507 lines up on runway 12 and is about to begin its takeoff. One key detail to note is that this aircraft has a tendency to turn right after takeoff when the controls are left unattended. This is due to asymmetries in its structure that occurred during its manufacturing. This is an important point to keep in mind, as this requires that minor corrections are regularly made by the pilot to keep the aircraft level when manually flying it. At 6 minutes past midnight, the takeoff roll begins and the aircraft takes off. The landing gear is also retracted. Going back to the tendency of the aircraft to roll to the right, the pilot is now correcting this by turning the aircraft controls to the left. Captain Francis does this corrective action for the first 1,000 feet that the aircraft gains in altitude. After the first 1,000 feet, the captain stops controlling the aircraft. This is likely due to them monitoring the weather radar to ensure that they do not enter a thunderstorm ahead. Also, for some reason, it seems that the pilots have assumed that they have engaged the autopilot. However, at this stage, the autopilot has not been engaged. Now that the aircraft is flying without any manual input from the pilot, nor the autopilot, the aircraft starts to roll to the right. Whilst this is happening, the bank angle of the aircraft is increasing. The bank angle is the angle at which the aircraft is turning. However, because the change in this bank angle is slow, the pilots have not realized this. This is a case of spatial disorientation. This can happen often when flying in night or cloudy conditions. It tends to happen when visual cues, such as the horizon, are not visible, usually in bad weather or at night. Pilots are trained to rely on their instruments. However, in this case, due to the poor weather, it's likely that the pilot's focus was on their weather radar for too long. About 20 seconds later, the bank angle of the aircraft has increased to beyond 30 degrees. In the Boeing 737, when the bank angle exceeds 30 degrees, a bank angle warning alarm usually goes off. When the pilots hear this warning, they are likely startled as they realize that they have been in a prolonged right turn for nearly half a minute and that their autopilot was also not engaged. Captain Francis then tries to correct the aircraft's bank angle immediately, and he initially turns his control wheel to the right, which worsens the situation. He then sharply turns it back to the left upon realizing his mistake. However, the initial input of right has already worsened the bank angle situation. With the worsening situation, the captain then states, "OK command," and presses the autopilot switch. However, the autopilot is still not effectively engaged. It's worth noting that this switch, CMDA, had suffered recurrent breakdowns for a period of 3 months before this flight. 5 seconds later, as the autopilot is not engaged, the aircraft's bank angle worsens to 55 degrees. The pilot also makes several bursts of rudder inputs to the right. This causes the bank angle to now reach 70 degrees. The rudder inputs to the right are worsening the situation, as this is pushing the nose of the aircraft further down. This, coupled with a high bank angle, have put the aircraft in an almost unrecoverable situation. However, there is not enough altitude left to recover from this position. Only 11 seconds after this, the aircraft drops from 2,900 feet all the way to the ground, crashing with a speed of 287 knots or 530 kilometers per hour. Unfortunately, the impact of this crash leaves no survivors. Shifting on to wildlife woes in India. A Spicejet flight's bizarre runway encounter in Surat with an unexpected intruder. Spicejet flight SG622, a Boeing 737, is about to take off for Delhi. It's positioned on runway 04 at Surat's airport in India on November 6, 2014. It then begins its takeoff roll in the late evening under good conditions. It accelerates to 50 knots, 60 knots, 70, And then just 350 meters after it began its takeoff roll, it now faces an unexpected obstacle in its path. A buffalo that had made its way on the runway. On that evening in November 2014, Spicejet's Boeing 737-800 is scheduled to depart from Surat and fly to Delhi with 151 passengers and 6 crew members. Surat Airport, managed by the Airports Authority of India, reports excellent weather, 6 kilometers of visibility, calm winds, and 29 degrees of temperature. This aircraft had landed from Delhi as flight SG623 at 6:15 p.m. earlier and had no reported issues. After a quick turnaround, it was cleared for departure as flight SG622 to Delhi. At about 7 p.m., the aircraft departs the gate and then taxis to runway 04, not anticipating what is about to occur in a few minutes. 5 minutes later, the air traffic control authorizes the aircraft to take off, and so the pilots engage the takeoff thrust and the Boeing 737 starts to accelerate down the runway. 40 knots, 50 knots, 60, 70, and then at 78 knots and just 350 meters from the start of its takeoff roll, amidst the darkness, the pilot notices a brief movement. But before he can respond, a loud impact shakes the plane, as a buffalo that had entered onto the runway had struck the left engine. So the pilot immediately aborts the takeoff and gets the aircraft to stop on the runway. And so the pilots inform the air traffic control, and after confirming that there was no fire or irregular engine readings, they requested to return to the parking bay. A while later, the aircraft taxis to the parking area and an inspection crew is brought out. The initial inspection reveals significant damage to the left engine. The nose inlet cowl is dented at the bottom right position, and the fan cowl is also damaged. The thrust reverser had a puncture and 9 fan blades were chipped or bent. There was no fire, luckily, and all 151 passengers and 6 crew members then disembarked the aircraft safely. But the main question here is, how had a buffalo managed to enter the runway? Shortly after this, the Ministry of Civil Aviation tasked the Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau with a thorough inquiry. This inquiry was then launched, and a few months later in 2015, an official report was released. A link to the report is in the description if you want to take a more detailed read. What the report essentially states is that there were major lapses at Surat's airport that led to this situation. The main issue was a breached airport boundary wall. When teams went out to inspect this wall days after the incident had taken place, they identified gaps in the 12.5-kilometer perimeter. The chain-linking fencing was compromised and had sections that were supported by wooden poles, and a 100-meter brick wall that was unstable. Gaps under the security gates were also found that could allow animals access to the airport's area. The operational area was covered with around 3 to 4 foot high vegetation, and this offered a hiding spot for wildlife. Also, nearby farms and water bodies attracted animals. In fact, just the day after this incident took place, another buffalo was spotted within the airport's perimeter. The Airports Authority of India requires daily perimeter checks of the airport, and this primarily includes checking that the airport's boundary wall is not compromised. But the record book showed that the last check was actually conducted on September 25th, which is more than a month before the day of the incident in November. On the day of the incident on November 6th, a runway inspection had been conducted at some point in the morning hours, but none was conducted before the flight's 7 p.m. departure. There has been an official mandate from the Airports Authority that requires inspections must be done at a higher frequency, usually requiring at least 4 inspections to be undertaken in a day, usually at dawn, then morning, afternoon, and then 1 at dusk. In fact, the inspection at dusk is also required to be more detailed and thorough and should cover the full length of the runway. The investigation also cited a human factor, known as the night blind spot. In low light conditions, there is a 5 to 10 degree area in the center of our visual field that becomes less sensitive to detecting objects. This is because the central retina has cone cells that are less effective in dim light, whereas the rod cells that are most sensitive to light are located on the periphery of the eye. As a result, in night conditions, this delays the detection of objects that are directly ahead. This night blind spot must have prevented the pilots from spotting the buffalo sooner, but had they noticed it sooner, there is not much that could have been done anyways at that speed to save the animal and the aircraft. Next up, from Russia with resilience, Ural Airlines' miraculous off-runway landing in a Siberian wheat field. Picture this, a massive Airbus A320, a jet built for sleek runways and busy airports, sitting smack dab in the middle of a Siberian wheat field. No runway, no control tower, just golden stalks and a whole lot of luck. This isn't a movie scene, it's the real-life story of Ural Airlines Flight 1383. This plane and its 167 passengers faced a wild twist of fate. How did they end up here? And what happened to the jet afterward? On September 12, 2023, Ural Airlines Flight 1383 departed from Sochi, a coastal city on the Black Sea, bound for Omsk in western Siberia. This was a routine 2,300-kilometer domestic flight. The aircraft, an Airbus A320-200, with a capacity for 180 passengers. On this day though, it carried 159 passengers and 6 crew members. Then, fast forward to 7:40 am local time. As they are descending into Omsk and runway 07 is right ahead, sitting at about 2,000 feet, they realize that their hydraulic system has failed. A failure in the green hydraulic system. The A320 has 3 independent hydraulic systems, green, yellow and blue, each responsible for key functions like landing gear deployment, flap extensions and braking. The green system, powered by an engine-driven pump on the left engine, had malfunctioned, likely due to a leak or a pump failure. This compromised the landing gear and some braking capability, though the yellow and blue systems provided a redundancy. Faced with this, the crew determined that landing at Omsk, with its 2,500-meter runway and limited maintenance facilities, posed risks. Then, the captain decides to go around, and, pitching the nose up, the A320 climbs back up to 18,000 feet. Omsk's runway is 2,500 meters long. However, with unreliable brakes, gusty winds, it's a gamble that they're not taking. They decide to divert to Novosibirsk, about 370 miles east, but with a 3,500-meter runway, hence plenty of space to roll out. The fuel is tight, and they calculate that they'll land with about 1,200 kilograms of fuel. Hence, they decide to call the emergency and turn east. However, there is another problem. When they try to retract the landing gear to climb up, the nose gear doors don't close. That hydraulic failure has struck once again. The open doors mean more drag, and with headwinds hammering them, the fuel is burning way too fast. Hence, they realize that they would not make it to Novosibirsk. Due to the low fuel warning, they have only one other choice left: to land in a field. The Airbus A320 executed an emergency landing in a field approximately 180 kilometers from Novosibirsk. The pilots configured the aircraft for low-speed approach, likely setting the flaps to a partial setting using the remaining hydraulic systems. Without the full landing gear functionality, they relied on gravity deployment, a backup mechanism that can be triggered manually. The plane then touched down at around 130 knots, or 240 kilometers per hour, and skidded roughly 500 meters through the wheat before stopping. Remarkably, all 167 individuals on board evacuated safely via emergency slides, with no reported injuries. The aircraft sustained moderate damage. The landing gear was partially collapsed. The engines had ingested soil and debris, clogging the turbine blades. Structurally, the fuselage remained intact, a testament to both the A320's design and the crew's skill. Post-landing assessments then revealed that the green hydraulic failure likely stemmed from a ruptured line, a rare but documented issue in A320 maintenance logs. The successful outcome hinged on the pilot's decision-making under pressure and the field's unexpectedly firm soil, which supported the 64-ton jet without any catastrophic sinking. The recovery posed a logistical challenge. Ural Airlines initially explored flying the A320 out by reinforcing the field into a temporary runway, a plan contingent on frozen ground in winter. Another proposal involved disassembling it on-site and then airlifting the components via heavy lift helicopters like the Mi-26. However, geotechnical surveys found the soil too soft to support takeoff, even at a reduced weight of 40 tons after defueling. Constructing a concrete runway was deemed cost-prohibitive, and it exceeded the airframe's $20 million value. By April of 2024, the decision was made to dismantle the aircraft. Engineers began removing the salvageable components, its wings, avionics, and the engines, for reuse in Ural Airlines fleet. This process is still ongoing as of March 2025 and is expected to conclude by the end of the year. The loss was significant for Russia's aviation sector, where Western sanctions have curtailed new aircraft acquisitions since 2022. The Russian Federal Air Transport Agency concluded its investigation in mid-2024, attributing the incident to crew error. The report cited inadequate fuel planning and procedural deviations during the hydraulic emergency. Over to the US for a controversial emergency. Delta Flight 89's fuel dump over Los Angeles neighborhoods. which ignited debates on safety protocols and public risk.
Los Angeles Tower, Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. We have an engine failure on engine number 2. We are declaring an emergency.
Do you want to remain over the ocean to dump fuel, or do you need to return back immediately?
We have got it under control. We are not critical.
Okay, so you don't need to hold or dump fuel or anything like that?
Negative. We would like runway 25 right.
On the 14th of January in 2020, Delta Airlines Flight 89 is scheduled to fly a routine journey to Shanghai. About 2 hours before the flight, the crew and the pilots make their way across the terminal, complete their pre-flight briefing, and then prepare the Boeing 777-200 aircraft for the long flight ahead. This flight, which is about 6,500 miles, takes them generally 14 hours to complete. Hence, it's also expected that on this route, there is a careful consideration of the fuel that is loaded. So, an hour before departure, the pilots request for a fuel up of the aircraft. In this case, for the nearly 14-hour trip to Shanghai, around 200,000 pounds of trip fuel is added. All aircraft usually have a maximum landing weight. This is the weight below which it is safe to land an aircraft. Keep this in mind as it will get important a bit later on. This aircraft has a weight that is significantly higher than the aircraft's maximum landing weight. So at the time of takeoff, the aircraft weighs more than what would be considered safe to land if it were to attempt a landing immediately. The aircraft being used today is a Boeing 777-200ER, the ER which stands for extended range, and it has extra fuel tanks added for longer routes. With this context of the fuel and the safe landing weights in mind, let's return back to January 14, 2020, 11:15 a.m. So the passengers have boarded and the flight is now ready to depart with 149 passengers and 16 crew members. And this includes the 3 pilots. One of them will be a relief pilot and step in later on in the flight when the captain or the co-pilot decides to take a rest. So with Flight 89 being cleared for departure by Los Angeles Tower, they commence a pushback and then start engine number 1, followed by engine number 2, which is about to run into problems shortly. Set their flaps to a takeoff configuration of 15 degrees, which is fairly common when taking off heavy. And then they begin the taxi towards runway 24 left. And the pilots likely requested the last taxiway entry into the runway to allow as much length for takeoff due to the aircraft's heavy weight. Once they get cleared for takeoff, they set their takeoff thrust and Delta 89 starts accelerating down runway 24 left. "80 knots. V1. Rotate. Positive rate. Gear up." As the main takeoff sequence is now complete, the Boeing 777 is performing as per usual, and it will take about 15 to 20 minutes to reach its initial cruise altitude of 32,000 feet. Generally, in shorter duration flights with this aircraft, it can go directly up to 35,000 feet or even higher. But in today's case, with the aircraft being much more heavy, it needs to fly at a lower altitude first to burn off some of its fuel and then get lighter, and then it can request for a higher cruise altitude. Generally, when aircraft do this, they tend to do it in increments of 2,000 feet. So if you started a cruise at 34,000 feet, you would then climb up to 36,000 and then possibly 38,000 towards the later end of your journey. Back to Flight 89. Delta 89 then takes a right turn just over the Santa Monica Harbor. And the Boeing 777 is now climbing past 7,000 feet. And then just out of the blue, a loud bang is heard from the right side of the aircraft. An explosion has just happened in the right-hand engine. In the cockpit, the engine number 2 fan speed can be seen dropping, with a master caution warning also sounding.
Looks like we have a compressor stall in engine 2. Los Angeles Tower, Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. We have a compressor stall on engine number 2. We are declaring an emergency.
Delta 89 has just suffered an engine compressor stall. And although the other engine is sufficient to allow the aircraft to slowly climb, this situation in most cases would require the crew to turn the aircraft back and carry out an emergency landing. The first officer then reads the quick reference handbook on the Boeing 777. The captain then puts engine number 2 to an idle mode, and then the engine's violent shaking stops. and the engine stops to surge. They have managed to get engine number 2 just in control. But before I move on, let me quickly explain what happens in a compressor stall. The way a jet engine works is that it sucks in air, then compresses it to increase the air pressure, then it adds fuel to the high pressure air to ignite the air, and this pushes the air through the turbines and out of the back to propel the aircraft forward. As this air is moving across the engine, it's passing through several stages of blades in the compressor. If there is any sudden change in the engine speed, or if there is any debris that has entered the engine, the airflow over these blades can get disrupted, and the air pressure in the compressor suddenly drops, causing the compressor to stall. Los Angeles Tower, Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. We have an engine failure on engine number 2. We are declaring emergency. The air traffic control then asks the pilots a very important question.
Do you want to remain over the ocean to dump fuel, or do you need to return back immediately?
And see, at this stage, the pilots have a choice to make. Their current aircraft weight is more than the maximum landing weight, as it has been filled up with 14 hours of fuel. Hence, landing immediately in this situation with a heavily fuel-loaded aircraft can be risky. But on the other hand, they have an engine that has had a compressor stall and is operating at idle power. Hence, effectively they are relying on engine number 1 to keep the aircraft flying. Generally, if the pilots believe that landing would be too risky with the higher weight, they would need to reduce this weight to match or be below the maximum landing weight.
Do you want to remain over the ocean to dump fuel, or do you need to return back immediately?
We have got it under control. We are not critical.
The captain is referring to getting the engine number 2 in control, as it was switched to an idle mode. Hence, this gave an indication that in this case, despite likely being over the maximum landing weight, the pilots deemed it safe enough to still go ahead with the landing at Los Angeles. At this point, it seems that the air traffic control was not expecting them to return back immediately, but instead to first dump out some fuel and then circle in back to land once their weight is below the maximum landing weight. And so the air traffic control asks them again.
Okay, so you don't need to hold or dump fuel or anything like that?
To this, the pilots respond,
Negative. We would like runway 25 right.
Runway 25 right at Los Angeles is the longest runway available, and the pilots strategically chose it as it would allow them the maximum distance available to stop the heavy aircraft. With this exchange being established, the pilots set up the aircraft to fly east across Los Angeles and then line up for an approach onto runway 25 right. But here onwards is where things start to get a bit messy, and a major breach of FAA rules also happens. Delta 89 has just told the air traffic control that they do not intend to dump fuel, but instead plan to come in for an emergency landing on runway 25 right. The air traffic control, as a result, have now cleared all the approaches and have paused any immediate takeoffs to allow for Delta 89 to land. Then, just as Delta 89 is descending down from 7,000 feet, the pilots surprisingly state something that diverts from what the initially agreed plan with the ATC was.
Commence fuel dumping.
Delta 89 has now started to dump its fuel without letting the air traffic controller know. And in just a few minutes, they are approaching a densely populated area in the suburbs of Los Angeles. Delta 89, which is now flying well below 5,000 feet and is still continuing to dump fuel, is now right above the areas of Cudahy and Southgate. The aircraft is flying low enough for its logo to be seen clearly on its belly. It's also flying low enough for people to notice the two white trails of jet fuel. Right below the aircraft is a school where students and their teachers are out in the open area. In the cockpit, the pilots are monitoring the fuel dumping and are hoping to shed off a few more thousand pounds of fuel. As the students look up to the sky, they observe a plane at a low altitude that seems to be flying over them. What they don't know is that those smoke trails are actually the fuel being dumped from Delta 89's wings. A couple of minutes later, the pilots stop the fuel dump, as Delta 89 is now just a few miles away from runway 25 right. By this point, they have dumped nearly 80,000 pounds of fuel, of which several thousand pounds have been dumped at a low altitude right on top of a populated area and a school. Delta 89 then goes on to touch down on runway 25 right and lands safely. Aircraft fire rescue teams have arrived next to the aircraft to inspect its brakes and its engine due to the heavy braking. Just a few kilometers away, the situation is far from safe. All that fuel that the aircraft had dumped whilst flying overhead has not had enough time to evaporate, and a majority of it has fallen directly on the school and the surrounding areas. 56 people have been sprayed with jet fuel. 17 of these happen to be the students from Park Avenue School. Just to give context of how low the aircraft was when overflying the school, at about 2,500 feet, which is about 700 meters, it would be the equivalent of someone dropping an entire swimming pool filled with fuel from the top. Emergency vehicles then arrive at Park Avenue School to check on the people that had been burnt by the jet fuel. Luckily, there are no casualties. In a span of 20 minutes, Delta 89 took off and then landed back. But what has left the air traffic control, the airline, and the FAA puzzled was the choice to dump fuel without informing the ATC. The FAA has strict regulations regarding fuel dumping, and according to these rules, fuel dumping is prohibited below 2,000 feet above the ground. Ideally, it should be dumped at altitudes above 5,000 feet. Moreover, the fuel must be dumped over unpopulated areas. The FAA's air traffic control publication also mandates that controllers must be informed if the pilots plan to dump fuel. This allows the air traffic control to provide coordinates and routes for the aircraft to safely dump fuel. However, Delta 89's crew deviated from these guidelines. The aircraft dumped fuel below the ideal height of 5,000 feet, over heavily populated areas, and without informing the ATC. When questioned about the need to dump fuel over a populated area, the pilot stated that it was necessary to achieve a safe landing weight, contradicting their earlier statement that they did not need to dump fuel. It's likely that under high stress and due to an engine stall, the pilots were overwhelmed and realized much later on that they were way below 5,000 feet whilst fuel dumping. 5 years have now passed since this incident, but no official report has been released. This specific aircraft was retired in October 2020 as Delta phased out its Boeing 777 fleet, and the Los Angeles-Shanghai route is now being operated with an Airbus A350. Next up, an Air India flight that flew 8 hours to nowhere. Air India Flight 119 flies at 35,000 feet, headed for New York, when an unexpected decision is taken by the crew. 4 hours into its trip, the pilots make a quick U-turn, guiding the aircraft back to Mumbai, retracing its route through the night. No announcement, no explanation, just 8 hours spent in the air, filled with questions. Passengers expecting a smooth trip across the Atlantic were left wondering what went wrong mid-flight. Then, the truth comes out. A passenger had found a brief handwritten note with an unsettling word written on it. This small note with barely a full sentence was enough to send the aircraft flying back to Mumbai. What began as a normal flight turned into a puzzle mid-air. What caused this major change, and how did a single note disrupt a transatlantic trip? Let's dive into the details of this unusual event. On March 10, 2025, Air India Flight 119, flown by a Boeing 777, is preparing for its long flight to New York from Mumbai's airport. At 1:40 a.m. local time, the plane leaves Terminal 2 and carries 322 people. 303 are passengers and 19 crew members. The flight begins normally, following its usual steps, and starts its planned 15-hour route. After takeoff, everything goes as per plan, and then 4.5 hours into the flight, at 35,000 feet over Azerbaijan and about 4,000 kilometers from Mumbai, a worrying discovery occurs. A passenger gets up to go to the washroom, and inside, he unknowingly finds a handwritten note. This note has a worrying sentence written on it. There is a bomb on this flight. Seeing this, he quickly informs the cabin crew, who then feeds this information to the captain. A decision is then quickly made to return back to Mumbai, skipping possible stops at closer airports like Istanbul or Dubai. At this point, the plane is roughly a quarter of the way to New York, still over 10,000 kilometers from its destination. So the pilots adjust the course and turn the aircraft back over the Caspian Sea, a move that surprises some passengers who notice the shift on their seatback flight maps. However, none of the passengers are told explicitly why they are flying all the way back to Mumbai. Then, after a total of 8 hours and 20 minutes in the air, Flight 119 lands back at Mumbai at 10:25 a.m. local time. The passengers are moved to a safe area while a thorough search of the aircraft is followed, checking everything from the cargo hold to the seats. This process takes about 5 hours, with sniffer dogs and specialized equipment being brought in to inspect every corner. Then, after several hours, officials find no explosive devices, and the threat is called a hoax. But the impact is serious, with hundreds of passengers being delayed and the airline facing a logistical mess in rescheduling the trip. The question to be asked here is, why did Air India decide to turn back and return to Mumbai instead of landing at a closer place like Istanbul or Dubai? When a bomb threat is reported mid-flight, airlines follow clear rules set by the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO. The captain, working with his crew, and the airline's operations center in Mumbai review the situation. They judge the threat's seriousness and choose the safest path forward, often consulting security experts on the ground. In this case, the handwritten note was taken seriously, despite its simplicity. Any hint of a bomb triggers a high alert response, no matter how vague. Here, the note's lack of detail, no specific place or time, caused doubt, requiring a careful response. Stopping in another country with a possible security problem on board would shift responsibility to local officials, possibly causing further delays due to different rules or coordination problems. Also, bringing an unconfirmed threat into another country's airspace raises political concerns, making the response harder. Returning to Mumbai offers access to known security teams, set procedures, and direct oversight by Indian officials like the Central Industrial Security Force, which guards India's airports. The Boeing 777's long range, over 14,000 kilometers, meant that the plane could make the round trip without refueling, a key factor since it still had over half its fuel left. Notably, this event matches a recent pattern. Multiple hoax threats affected Indian flights in October 2024. Some traced to social media pranks, raising questions about how airlines can filter real dangers from fake ones. India itself has had nearly 1,000 hoax threats in 2024, something concerning considering how disruptful one hoax can be. This case stands out due to its length, 8 hours of flight time with no destination change, with the flight rescheduled for March 11th at 5 am. No suspect behind this note has been named yet, leaving the why unanswered. With India's aviation sector growing and new airlines like Air Kerala starting in 2025 and passenger numbers expected to hit 300 million annually by 2030, security steps must keep pace. The country's regulators are now pushing for stricter penalties for hoax threats. Air India continues to seek improvements, but events like this show the challenges that are involved, where even a scribbled note can ground a plane. Wrapping up with ongoing concerns in Indian aviation, a series of tailstrikes that have affected Indian carriers over the last 2 years. Indigo Flight 6E5325 is flying from Mumbai to Chennai with 186 people on board. Everything seems fine as the Airbus A321 starts its descent towards Chennai. But then, the tail hits the runway, causing a tail strike and nearly leads to a disaster. This isn't the first time for India's biggest airline, Indigo, and it's happened several times before, surprisingly with the same aircraft just a few months prior. Let's go through what happened. On 8th of March this year, Indigo Flight 5325 took off from Mumbai's airport, a busy place that handles over 50 million passengers a year. It was a regular flight to Chennai, just over 1,000 kilometers and usually taking less than 2 hours. Before the departure, the plane went through all of its checks and there were no problems reported. It had returned to service on February 6, 2025 after being out for over 5 months for repairs from a previous issue. At around 11:50 am, it left the gate and then took off from runway 27. The weather on this day was clear, everything looked fine, and air traffic control approved the flight to head southeast to Chennai. The takeoff went as planned, suggesting a normal flight ahead. Then, fast forward to 1:55 pm, the plane is on final approach to Chennai's International Airport, another large airport that sees over 20 million travelers per year. It approaches runway 25, a 3.6 kilometer runway. The conditions are good, with clear skies and 33 degrees of temperature. There's a light wind of 5 to 10 knots and the visibility is over 10 kilometers. The runway is also dry, so there are no obvious reasons for any trouble. But then, something goes wrong during the landing. The tail of the Airbus A321 made contact with the runway, causing a tail strike. This implied that the back part of the aircraft hit the ground. Early reports suggested that the pilot raised the nose too much, causing the tail to touch down. Later, they found marks on runway 25 showing where it had happened, extending several meters. The pilots managed to stop the plane safely despite the issue. All 186 people on board were fine and got off at the terminal normally. Many probably didn't know that there was a problem until much later on. The plane, however, had visible damage to its rear section and was moved to a hangar for a detailed check. Air traffic control had stopped activity on runway 25 for a short time to look for debris, but then it reopened within an hour. This was just the beginning of a larger issue. Now, let's look at this specific aircraft, VTIBI. Indigo got this A321neo in February of 2023, but it's had problems before. On September 9th of 2024, it had a tail strike during takeoff from Delhi, which kept it out of service for over 5 months, until repairs on it were completed by the 6th of February 2025. Then, just over a month later, it seemed to have this issue once again in Chennai. The A321 is longer than most airplanes in the Airbus A320 family. It's about 7 meters longer than the Airbus A320. This extra length means that the landing has to be done more carefully. If the nose goes up too far, the tail can hit the ground. The pilots need to manage it well, and with VTIBI having this happen twice, it makes you wonder what's going on. So what's caused this tail strike in Chennai? Now, as of April 2025, India's Accident Investigation Bureau is still looking into it. But there are some ideas. One possibility is how the pilot handled the landing. With an Airbus A321, you have to lower it just right. Raising the nose too much can make the tail hit the runway. The training could also be a part of it. In July of 2023, Indigo was fined 30 lakh rupees after several tail strikes. And the aviation authorities said that their pilot training and maintenance needed improvement. Then, there is the aircraft VTIBI itself. It suffered 2 tail strikes in less than a year. One during takeoff at Delhi and then one during landing at Chennai. Is this just a coincidence, or is there actually some sort of an issue with the plane? This is what the investigation that's ongoing is trying to figure out. Let's explain what a tail strike is. It's when the tail of a plane touches the ground during takeoff or landing. This doesn't happen often, maybe once or twice in 10,000 flights, but it's a problem when it does. The tail has important parts, like the structure that keeps the cabin pressure and a small backup engine called the APU. So any damage can keep a plane out of service for several months. It's also about how the plane is angled. For an Airbus A321, if the nose goes past about 11 degrees during landing or 13 degrees during taking off, the tail can hit the ground. This plane being longer means that there is less room for mistakes. They usually put a small protector on the tail, but this doesn't always help enough. For most airlines, it just means more repairs and delays. This isn't the only time. Indigo has had at least 6 tail strikes with its A321s in the last 2 years. They are the biggest airline in India, with over 300 planes and flights all over, but even they can have issues such as these. The investigation isn't just about this flight. It's checking Indigo's training, crew decisions, and how they maintain planes. This tail strike in Chennai might be part of something bigger, but we can only know once the investigation is completed and the report is out. As of now, VTIBI, the aircraft, is off duty, waiting to see if it can fly again.